Yeah. Josh, thank you for taking the time to talk to me about this sort of special part of your life. You chose your dad as the person that you would most want to, or one of the people that you would most want to have his life documented on film. And why did you pick your dad?
Well, thanks for having me and letting me talk about it. I picked my dad
Sure.
because he's been such, or was, I guess. So my dad died 22 years ago, 23 years ago now. Um, he was such a force in our family. He was such a force in my life, and so much of an influence, I guess, on everything I've done since his death, which frankly came about because of his death in many ways. And he just is among the most fascinating people I've ever met and I've ever read about. And I wish there was more about him that I knew. And I'm excited to share the stories I know about him. And to some extent, given what you guys do and my disappointment, I guess, that we never were able to capture. It's the stories I don't know, right? There's so much that I feel like I do know. And I know that means there's, I don't know, an equal or greater number of stories that I
Right.
don't know, and I wish I did. And so yeah, I'm always excited to talk about him and think about him, and my mom as well. By the way, I don't want to discount my mother's role in all of this, but my dad was really a monumental figure in my life.
Mm. So, what was his name, and paint a picture of him, what he
Yeah,
did, and his personality.
yeah. So my dad's name was Burt Kanter. He was one of three boys he was born on the East Coast. His parents and my mom's parents as well, both basically came from nothing, Eastern European immigrants to the U.S. They both grew up on the East Coast. They were high school sweethearts. I think my mom was actually supposed to date one of my uncles and then got set up with my dad. And so
One of those stories.
ended up with my dad. Um, so kind of the old school, whatever. Uh, they ended up coming to Chicago in the mid 50s or so, maybe the early 50s, I guess, for my dad to go to college and ultimately law school. Um, Both he and his brothers, the three of them, all were really brilliant, all went off and created fantastic careers. I don't think any of the three were as colorful as my father, or the two others were as colorful as my father, but all turned out to be very, very successful. Um, he ended up going to University of Chicago for college and law school. My understanding of it is back in the early 50s when he went there. I think tuition was $250, which I imagine, obviously inflation adjusted, was still probably a significant amount of money, but nevertheless, they couldn't afford it. He was on full scholarship. My mom was typical of that generation. She was older than he was, and she became a teacher, and pretty sure that she put him through school, and other than obviously to scholarship and those kinds of things. He ended up going through University of Chicago college and law school in a total of 5 years, which back then and even now would obviously be pretty amazing. I don't remember how old he was. I think he went to college when he was like 16 or something. So he was done pretty early. And after law school, he moved around a little bit. He became a teacher at University of Indiana. He clerked for the United States Tax Court. So they moved around a bit. They were in Indiana, obviously, and in Washington, and then landed back in Chicago, where he ended up in private practice. And that's where I guess the colorful stuff starts. So he became kind of this world-renowned, certainly nationally renowned, but really world-renowned tax lawyer. Worked for a firm for a little while, and then he and one of his partners broke off and started their own firm and became kind of a tax boutique back in the late 50s, early 60s, and pioneered, just as somebody said recently to me, who's actually writing a book that's going to have my dad as among the central characters, said it wasn't just, I don't remember exactly how he said it, wasn't just that he came up with strategies, that he basically pioneered an entire industry around the tax work that he was doing. He was very vocal about it. He was very open about it. Probably wrote 100 law review articles and all these kinds of things about what he was doing and how he was doing it, and invited people to copy him. And so, I think of the era I grew up in, or at least practiced law in, when people were really having their clients execute non-disclosure agreements and you couldn't talk about it. Here was this guy who was like openly writing about everything that he did. Represented really a who's who of corporate industrial America and really international figures as well. Super interesting in that sense. Lots of things that you continue to see today, especially in the United States, of course, but that are really tied back to his work in the tax world. And ultimately, this brings him into what really becomes the colorful, kind of fascinating stories that he ends up as a real target of the Internal Revenue Service pretty much for his entire professional life. By the mid-1960s, the Internal Revenue Service is going after him all the way until actually 12 years after his death. So he died in 2004.
And why was that?
So, there's a lot of good theories about why. I'm not sure that anybody knows with certainty, of course, right? He clearly was costing the government literally billions of dollars, in the sense that he was, I believe, obviously there's always two sides to a story, so I'm perfectly happy to recognize that. I believe he was always essentially coloring within the lines, or at least what he determined, the lines should be and the rules that were put on the table. But he was really good at what he did and came up with things that nobody, thought of. And so, and there's some theory. So the IRS went after him criminally in the mid-1970s, and then actually went after him when they failed to do that. He was acquitted in that case, and then they went after him civilly in a case that started in 1979 and was still raging in 2000 when he got sick, which is when I really stepped in. And then that case went for 12 more years. He died in 2001, and that case went for 12 more years, including going to the U.S. Supreme Court. And some people think that because he was so open about what he was doing and he was writing it, that the Internal Revenue Service took that as kind of he was flaunting it, and that really pissed him off. I have no idea. Like, there's never been an answer to why. So whether it's just that he was, I'm sure people think he was pushing envelopes, right? I think he was within the lines, and most of the strategies that he put in place that went to litigation on behalf of clients, they won almost everything. And so that would argue to me that they were within the lines, at least as the courts ultimately, made that decision. But so it was interesting to grow up. I mean, it was really kind of around my teen years. I usually, talk about it in my bar mitzvah years, right? Where my dad was on criminal trial in Chicago. So that was pretty traumatic.
What was that like for you?
I don't know that I remember enough. But it was really traumatic because the firm, there were four main partners in, wow, that was weird. Sorry. There were four main partners in the law firm. And it ultimately split up the firm, and it ruined relationships. And the four partners we all traveled together. All the kids knew each other. I mean, it was like a family, like an extended family. And it was really traumatic in terms of the destruction of some of those relationships and what happened as all those families went through that together. So there's that side of it. But, we also came through it. He was acquitted, and, life went on, and then started, even though I didn't really know it at the time, then started this whole civil action against him, the one that I'm referring to that started in 1979 and went till 2012. So it went for 33 years of fighting. And it's one of the things when I talk about how important my dad was to me is that when he got sick, so he got sick in 2000, he was 70, as I said. And this is a guy who we thought was going to die at his desk, of a heart attack at 100, right? Just like, I guess anybody thinks that, and here we are losing him 30 years earlier than we think we're going to. And this litigation is raging, and we have this wildly complicated enterprise. And I come in, and when he died, the moment that tax case that started in 79 came to a really, really vicious opinion against him from the tax court in 2000. And so between 2000 and 2001, when he died, we were in the the very, very beginning of the appellate stage of that litigation. But the front page headlines essentially were vilifying my father. Like he was public enemy number one kind of thing, right? And so my coming in not only was to help protect my family, but frankly for me was this opportunity to hopefully go restore my father's reputation. When this opinion came out in 2000, and it was interesting because it came out, there's a New York Times article about it on January 1st, 2000. And of course, if everybody remembers, what were we all thinking we were going to wake up to on January 1st, 2000 was all the computers exploding because it was Y2K, right?
Yeah,
and
Y2K.
We wake up to this like New York Times headline that says, Burt Kanter, architect of tax evasion scheme or something. Like it was awful. And he was thrown off a public company board that he sat on. It again, now second iteration of his law firm blowing up. All kinds of people who had been friends forever, who turned their back on him. Interestingly, the only place that did not was the University of Chicago, where he was then teaching. And so this idea of being able to restore my father's reputation was really important to me. And ultimately, by the way, the end of that story is we had to go through 3 circuit courts and the U.S. Supreme Court, and we won. And we won the case multiple times, but nevertheless, we won in the end. And there's some great articles about that and clearly restoring my father's reputation. So that whole process was super intellectually interesting to me, clearly tied me to my father, and in a really sappy kind of way. And I always feel weird saying this, but I was actually in the room when my dad took his last breath, and in such a cliche kind of way, I hate to say it, like his dying words to me, literally his dying words to me, the last words he spoke to me were, "Take care of your mother and your sister." And I'm like, oh, holy cow, that's a burden, right? And so the idea of really being so tied to him and so tied to this goal of serving my family and then restoring his reputation, drove a good part of my adult life. I mean, this all happened. So this was 2001 when he died. And so I would have been 39. So I was an adult and a practicing lawyer and, whatever. But that really shaped that next stage of my professional career, of my ethos, of who I am, of what I do still to this day is all tied back to, those results. Plus, again, as we tell the stories, like he's just the most fascinating person. So that's that. Sorry.
And you were, just out of curiosity, thinking of your father's personality and what, how he led his life. If you had come to him at some, auspicious moment and said, "Dad, I really want to take the time to record some of your life story. I want you to, do it in front of a camera." How do you suspect he would have responded to that request? And assuming he would have said yes, if you do think that, how would he have kind of taken on that opportunity, that experience?
Yeah, I think he would have been totally open to it. He was, in fact, it's funny when he got sick, there's all kinds of things, of course, I'm now thinking of that are circa 2000, which doesn't seem that long ago, but the first plasma TVs were coming out, the first flat screen plasma TVs, and they cost a fortune. And I remember buying one, so we could put it in my dad's bedroom, which is, he was now confined to bed and whatever. So anyway, and I went out and bought a new video camera, and the whole idea was we didn't know how long we had with him. We thought we might have 6 months. We got 18, so that was huge. Mm-hmm. And I went out and actually bought a video camera, and the thought was that he and I would sit and actually tell some of these stories, and we never got to it. I'm not sure that video camera ever made it out of the box, but and of course that's in a condition when he was sick. But I have to believe my dad knew he had a fascinating life. Like, it's just incredible who he was hanging out with, who he was working with, the things that he was involved in. Again, I'll get to some of that, but I don't think he would have had any problem with it. I think he would have loved it. And I think for me, it would have been great to have his own perspective, of course, on it. And And it would have been great to, he's of an era. I mean, now my dad was born in 1930. So I'm trying to do math quickly. What's that? What would that make him now in 2024? So that's 70, 90.
Yeah, right.
So the problem is a lot of his clients, of course, and the people he was working with were older. So we've lost that opportunity. Everybody's dead. And I think that he would have been completely open to our having pursued that both with him and frankly, even after he died. And I'm really disappointed in myself that we didn't pursue this. We knew it was there. We knew we wanted to do this and we just never did it. And so it's really sad that we lost that opportunity as people started to die.
Yeah. One of the things we ask people when they do have the chance to do this, and we are, looking at the kinds of things we would talk, with their family members about, we ask someone like yourself, like, okay, what would you like us to talk about with your father? What themes, what moments, what eras? And also, beyond this, just the sequence of events and the stories, it's like, what is it that you're curious about? Like, what is that, what would you want to grab, that would feel like, if this is really my dad? And what do you think that would be for you now? I mean, you have the benefit of hindsight.
So with hindsight, especially, right? It's interesting. I mean, I think for me, I'd love to know, first of all, just what did he think of his life? Right. And what did he think of this career that he built and this role that he played? And what did he think of what everybody else thought? All these things. Like everybody, I've got my own perspective, my own view of what this was all about. But that's mine. That's not his. He never told me that. So I don't know what he thought of it. There are things that, and again, as you said, especially with the benefit of hindsight. So when my mom passed away then a few years later. She passed away in 2007. And my sister was the only one who was still back in Chicago at that point. And so she, of course, got stuck cleaning out their house. And they'd been in the last house they were in for 25 years or whatever. And a lot of crap to go through, right? Like any situation when you've had a family that's grown up in this house. And as she's cleaning it out, how she found this is like remarkable to me. She finds this letter. And this letter is from 1954, clearly written on a typewriter, right? And my dad, and you can see like the X outs and stuff, like there's no correction tape, nothing.
Yeah.
And so it's this letter that, as far as we can tell, is written by my dad in 1954 back to a law school professor at the University of Chicago. And he's clearly in Washington at that point. And he says something about a law firm has offered him a job and offered him $1,500 a year, and he doesn't think he can support his family on that, which is a curious question because at that point there were no kids yet. My brother was born in 1956, but anyway, I haven't figured that one out. But can't support my family. And then there's this line that says, and remember, so this is 1954. He's like a kid. And there's this line that says, while I'm here, I think I'll go stick my head in at the Department of Justice and the Internal Revenue Service and get my face and name known around there. Well, how prophetic is this? Like, oh my God. And so I would love to be able to say to him, like, do you remember writing this? And how amazing is this? How funny is this? But how amazing is this? Like, look at what your whole life has been. And now I use this when I do presentations about what I do now. And I tell this kind of family story, and I'm like, well, apparently that worked. It's just shocking, what came out of that. So anyway, I'd love to hear him tell the stories. I'd love to hear what he thinks of his own life. I mean, he was the most calm, intelligent, kind. There's a story about, I guess I won't reveal a name in this particular case, but there's a story that I heard after he died, of him going to a meeting with a very famous person, whatever, who had a reputation for recording all of his meetings, and that supposedly the guy would replay the recording of his meeting with my dad simply because he liked the tone of my dad's voice. Like, that's that somebody would tell me that story is crazy,
Yeah.
right? It's just nuts. And that's not even like touching the things that he was involved in. That's just this crazy story.
Mhm.
So,
What was he like as a dad to you?
you know, it's interesting. I feel really, really close to my father, and I don't have an ounce of disappointment, regret, whatever. But my dad's life was work. And so, he and my mom, as I understand it, had a deal. My dad was on the road 6 days a week. He was in the office every Saturday. He often left town on Sunday and came back. And the deal with my mom was you will be home for Shabbat dinner. And so he was home, I don't know if this is really true, but let's say every Friday night for dinner. But that was it. By Saturday morning, he's back downtown at the office. By Sunday, he's probably back on an airplane and gone. And so arguably, it's interesting. And I think the three of us, that me, my brother, and my sister, all probably would tell a completely different story and have different reactions to what that meant. But it doesn't, for me, it didn't create any real level of disappointment or anything else. I think once my dad was not like, this was not a guy, as far as I could tell, who enjoyed having toddlers and babies. But he did enjoy having adult children. And I think by the time we became adults and could talk, like in an intelligent fashion, that I think he really enjoyed that. And he loved his family. I don't think there's any doubt that he loved us. And he was just out doing what that generation and that era did. And he had no hobbies. Like, this was not a sports guy. He was not a golfer. Like, literally, work was his passion, his hobby, his work. That was what it was. So there's a story here now. I'll start interjecting stories if that's okay. So there's a story when
Please.
In Chicago, if you go back to kind of the mid or late 70s, probably the most famous National Hockey League player was a guy named Bobby Hull. Everybody in Chicago, I mean, anybody across the country probably knew who Bobby Hull was, but certainly if you were in Chicago, you knew who Bobby Hull was. And so there's a story about Bobby Hull coming to see my dad for tax advice. And as the story goes, of course, I'm like 14 years old or whatever, so I don't know, right? But the story goes that all the secretaries in the law firm are peering in like, Bobby Hull's in the office, Bobby Hull's in the office. And everybody's excited that Bobby Hull is in the office, right? At the end of this meeting, as I'm told the story goes, my dad turns and says to Bobby Hull, "Hey, Bobby, do you mind if I ask you a personal question?" And Bobby says, "No, Burt, ask me anything you want." And my dad says, "What do you do for a living?" He had no idea who the hell he was talking to. He just was talking to a guy who had a tax problem. Zero idea who was sitting in front of him. And that's who my dad was. Like, it was all intellectual.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously had Bobby Hull been some, famous business person, I'm sure my dad would have known. But all to say again, like, my dad was kind of an absent dad. And so it's sort of interesting to me that I feel so close to him and I have no resentment over that. And I do think, again, the three of us would probably tell a different story and have lived our lives in different ways because of that.
And let's just say you did have, your dad's perspective, and you had his voice and his gestures and the way he would, tell his own life story. What do you think having that would give you now at this moment in your life?
I think in some respect it would just be a smile, right? Having his perspective on some of the stories would be just, to me, fascinating, and just, it would make me laugh, it would make me smile, it would make me whatever. Some of it would make me more comfortable. I have this perspective of my dad, again, particularly because, of course, this whole IRS pursuit over all these years. He never showed it. He never showed stress. He never showed fear. He never showed any real result of it. And so I'd love to know, was he as calm about it as we all thought he was? it's hard to now imagine. Like, so he's on criminal trial in 1976. That means he's 46 years old. He's got 3 kids. He's got a wife. He's got a life, right? It's hard to imagine, how does that not affect you? And so I'd love to know, like, I never got to talk to him about, how did that affect you? What did that mean to you? And in addition, although he was wildly successful, it's an era in which a lot of his friends and clients became billionaires and really successful. And so, and he lost a lot of those years because he was basically fighting for his life. But then on the other side of that, here's this, by the mid 1960s, so he's in his 30s, and this is all like really amazing for me to look back and think, oh my God, in my 30s, like I'm having fun, but I'm still like, I'm a young lawyer, I'm going to bars,
Yeah.
This is a guy who was recognized across the country and to some extent, again, across the world as the foremost tax authority like on the planet. I can't even conceive of that at 30 years old and then being indicted at 46 years old. Like, that's crazy to me. So just understanding his emotional state during all of this.
Yeah.
And again, the idea, he was involved in so many different things, again, because he took this perspective. And again, I'm applying my perspective on what I think was his perspective, right? His perspective on tax law was to use it as a tool to do all these other things. So he helped launch the cable TV industry through tax strategies. He worked in Hollywood through tax strategies. He worked in the music industry through tax strategies. Like, crazy. So here's a guy, and this is all public record, right? But who represents families like the Pritzkers and Hyatt Hotels, and by the way, represented people who would not be caught dead being represented by the same lawyer, but he was such the go-to person that he represented the Pritzkers and the Hiltons at the same time. He represented Hugh Hefner and Bob Guccione at the same time. People who, again, were like, enemies is not the right word, right? But diabolical competitors and rivals. And they would all go to Burt Kanter, which is astounding to me. He was involved in the music industry, represented Creedence Clearwater Revival. The only person on the planet I know who hates my father is John Fogerty from Creedence. There's a whole song about called Zantz Can't Dance. Zantz is Saul Zaentz, who was the producer of Fantasy Records and Creedence's producer, and Kant, which is spelled in the song title K-A-N-T, is Burt Kanter. So, but other than that, super cool that he represented that. He was, again, in the film industry. He was involved in hundreds of films, but One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Longest Yard and Papillon, like some really cool stuff. And then I actually, my oldest son is just graduating from college, and while he's been in college, this generation is now back into vinyl, and I still have all my albums from when I was growing up. So I've been sending my son through college. I sent him a care package of albums every month through all of college. So he had all my albums by the end of college, which was really fun. So I go into his room one day last year, and he's got a whole wall of album covers, and one of them is Rocky Horror Picture Show. And I'm like, hey, have I ever told you the story of Rocky Horror Picture Show? And he's like, no, why? I just thought it was an album. And I'm like, well, your grandfather financed that movie as a tax shelter deal. And the story, again, like, so funny because this was just a tax shelter movie deal. And then royalty checks start showing up years later. And all the lawyers, which are a bunch of old white men, right, or middle-aged white men, are like, why are we getting royalty checks? They had no idea it had become a cult classic and that it's now playing, across the country. And it's just these kind of like, these are the things he was involved in an era.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess every era looks interesting, but I mean, to me, the 60s to the 80s, like, what a crazy era to be flying around and doing all these cool things. And he was involved in international developments and cable TV and Ticketmaster. And again,
Sounds like there would be like endless visuals and visuals and photos and, that would really bring his story to life in a
Yeah.
way that
Yeah.
maybe his more subdued personality would, he would kind of, he would be the perfect, person to be cool about all of it. But then you see the Rocky Horror
Oh,
Picture
wow.
Show, album cover, and you're like, oh, okay.
And he was the
So
coolest about all of it. Like, he would just get this little smirk and this little glint in his eye. And everybody in the family knows exactly what that smirk and that glint. But it was just this quiet, subtle acknowledgement.
Mhm.
But there would never be boasting about it, right? There would never be, it would just be this little smile. And it's just hysterical. He was, if you know Second City, which was kind of a Chicago icon, right? That was the precursor to Saturday Night Live. When they opened, there was, I think I know the story partially, that when they opened, there was a cabaret tax in Chicago and they were considered live theater, but they couldn't afford it. And so they came to my father and somehow, I have no idea how, he got them out of the cabaret tax and that allowed them to actually open and operate. And so we grew up going to Second City and watching, Gilda Radner and Chevy Chase and Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi. It's just mind blowing to me. Again, kind of these things. But if he were to talk about that, I promise it just would be a little smirk in the corner of his mouth.
yeah,
Just
yeah,
crazy. And then it goes
okay.
like not just the cool things. The criminal trial I mentioned in the 70s. Went back and had a lot to do with the use of offshore trusts, which back in those days he was a pioneer of, and I would argue were being used legally in that environment, but later obviously became a huge problem or whatever, or abused. And there's it's too long a story to bother you with like all the details of it, but there's it involves IRS agents and supposedly setting up, bankers with call girls and like there's some really crazy stuff. But it turns out that there's a bank at the center of this whole thing.
Yeah.
And the bank, it turns out, is a front for the Central Intelligence Agency. And so even going back to your comment of what would I'd want to know, like, it's impossible, frankly, for me to believe my dad didn't know that. But did he? I'll never know. No, I'm not sure he would have ever told me the truth anyway. But it's just like, it's like these things that touch his life is nuts. It's just nuts and fun.
So let me ask you this. What of who he was do you feel like you are now trying to, or maybe you are successfully living out? I sort of don't think you're working 6 days a week and hardly seeing your family, but maybe you you are going with that model. But what are you endeavoring to live out of who he was and matters to you? You feel like, yeah. This is what I'm taking through.
Yeah. So I'm not, I have a very close relationship with my children. I won't say my brother, I think, for example, never missed a soccer practice for his kids. I think that was a reaction to my dad not being around. I didn't go to that extreme. I probably didn't miss a lot of games. I traveled with my ski racing son across the country while he ski raced and, all these things. So sure, there was like a pendulum swing, but we also didn't need to do that, right? I mean, we had family wealth. I was a lawyer and a pretty good one at that, I'll say. So my wife was a lawyer. So we had, 2 lawyer incomes. It's not like, excuse me, I had to be on the road 6 days a week to accomplish what I was trying at that point in time to accomplish. So I'm not sure it's really a reaction, but it also is just a different era, right? By the time I grow up and have kids, my first was born in 2001, right after my dad passed away, 6 weeks after my dad passed away. Kind of always thought my dad was reincarnated in my oldest kid. That's a whole nother thing. But so we didn't have to do that. Like, I get why my dad did it, which is why I say I don't have any resentment about it. Um, but I think something my parents did instilled in us a work ethic, all of us, a work ethic that, I mean, I do work basically 7 days a week, not in the same way, right? But there's not a day that I'm away from my email or phone or whatever. I work 7 days a week. I work, 10 hours a day. Not at the absence of seeing my kids, right? And being part of their lives. And I think we're as close as a parent and kids can be. But I am emulating that work ethic, I guess, in a sense. I'm emulating, I don't know, emulating is the right word, because I don't know that that's what he was trying to do. To me, I'm really trying to live my life that I'm accomplishing something, that I'm helping people. You obviously know that I've started this company, Leaf Planner, and that's really about, it's frankly an extension of everything I learned from him and the career that I've had since his death, but it's about helping families. It's really important to me to be open, and like when I talk about him writing these law review articles, like, again, I think you know this, like, I share everything I've learned. I talk about it. I write about it. I do whatever I can to help other people learn from what I've done, with no expectation of reward for that, right? It's just what I feel like is and I hesitate to say giving back, because that to me really implies philanthropy in a way that I do not think giving back to the community who I typically work with or for is philanthropic by any means, but it is doing something to help families without an expectation of anything in the other direction. My parents were very philanthropic. We've all adopted that as well. Again, I don't know that it's an emulation, but there are a number of things that I've done, and I've said, I do this. The lens I look through is very often, will my children respect or be proud of that? And I don't think that that's why my dad did things, but the fact that I'm so proud of my father and respect him so much, I imagine is driving me to do that, even if that wasn't his motivation for it. But that's a huge lens for me, is how will my kids look at this? Will they look at me the way I look at my father? I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, it certainly did. The final question, and we of course need dozens more hours to be able to talk about all these incredible stories of your dad. But my final question, Josh, is if you had the opportunity to now, in this moment today, if you had the opportunity to talk to your dad again and say something to him, what do you think you would want to say?
So it's interesting that you're asking that of what would I want to say, not what I want to ask, right? So one, I guess I would want, and although I don't think there's any doubt that he knew, but I'd want him to know how much I loved him and respected him and was in awe of him. And yet doing that in a completely, like, that I don't, again, the comment of not having any regret and not having any disappointment, that it's not, I think there are a lot of successful father-son relationships, right? Where somebody is, you could be all those things. I could respect you and be in awe of you, but still be resentful in some way. And I'm not. And so I'd want, I guess, him to know. And I'd want him to know that, I don't know, I guess the same thing. I'm just in awe of the impact he had on his family, on the world, on this industry that I think he created, on the things that he did. Yeah, I'd like to know if he's proud of me. So, but that would be if I asked him a question. So, yeah, that'd be it.
You can always sneak in a last question for yourself. It's a good one.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Josh, I have so enjoyed hearing just some of the colorful bits about your dad and getting kind of a picture of him. And I really love the photo that you shared of him and how you guys are kind of in this such a similar physical stance. And I thought that's very telling, I think, of
Yeah.
your yeah, your interest in yeah, living out his legacy to a certain extent in your own way.
Yeah.
So
Maybe we can put that picture
thank you so
with
much
the
for
podcast. Um,
we will, we will.
that was so crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, you obviously know that story, but that, like, when I saw those two pictures together, which was so unintentional, as I told you, and it's crazy. I mean, we're sitting there, the arms are crossed, the fingers are in the same position. Like, it's nuts. Really, really funny. But thank you so much for letting me share some stories about him and talk about him.
My absolute pleasure.
Great. Thanks again.
Well, Josh, that was really fun.
Was that okay?
And yeah, it was great.
Okay.
And I only wish that I mean, your dad is worthy of a series. Like of conversations about all these things, I mean, but I appreciate just like some of the details of the stories that you shared, and also just what you shared of your own reflections on your own life. And so thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording, and I was going to just say, I forgot to mention this to you at the top, that